you've been at today that you're really unhappy with yourself, that you didn't come at 9 o'clock this morning. It's been a great time. We're really looking forward to it. We've got 2 more sessions, and then we have a Q&A. And if you have a question formulated in your mind, there are some 3x5 cards. I think they're just outside the auditorium, sitting on a table. And if you could pick one of those up and write your question on it, then if we have multiple questions, Dr. Miller will have a chance to take a look at it and be prepared to give you the answer that you desire. It has really been good to be here today, and we're going to try to give Dr. Miller back a minute or two that we took away from him because we were a little slow getting back in at the last section. Dr. Miller?
Now, we all ate well for lunch, so don't let that be an excuse to take a nap. I'll call you out from up here. How about that? I'm just kidding, young people. I'm just kidding. Maybe. All right. So the flood, a very different portrait than the one maybe that we oftentimes have in our minds when we think of what this would have been like. This was no pleasure cruise for Noah and his family. Well, on the same day that the waters began to decrease, the ark rested in the mountains, plural, so this is just a geographical area, of Ararat. And the waters continued to recede for another 4 months. And during that period of recession, we know that the retreating flood waters would have catastrophically eroded many of Earth's canyons, though not all of them. The Green Canyon, we think, came later. After 9 months, on the first day of the 10th month, Noah could see the tops of various mountains. And then after another 40 days, he sends out a raven and a dove, and then waits another week and sends the dove out again. And then after it returns, he waits another week and sends the dove out. Now the dove doesn't return. He waits about another month and then finally removes the covering from the ark, sees that the surface of the earth is dry. And then after another almost 2 months, the earth then is completely dried. He finally leaves the ark. So the timeline, as given in the text, is based on the Jewish calendar, which you have to keep in mind is based on a lunar year, which has 354 days total. And so based on the text, a year and 11 days passes. And so when you convert that from the lunar to the solar calendar, we find that from beginning to end, Noah and the other passengers left the ark after exactly 1 solar year, so exactly 365 days. So Noah and his family, 8 people exit the ark, and from those 8 people repopulate the entire earth. And so genetically, we all have a portion of Noah and a portion of his wife in our blood, regardless of our ethnicity. But whether or not the wives of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth were also part of Noah's family, like sisters or cousins, we don't know that. So they could have actually been from other Sethite groups or even Canaanite families, for all we know. So if so, the portion of our genes that would be traced solely back to Noah would grow or diminish. But unless all 8 survivors are in Noah's family, then it can't be said genetically that all of our blood came just from Noah and his wife. It all came from Adam and Eve much further back in time. The passengers from the ark found a completely different earth, of course, from the one that they knew before the flood. It would be like getting off a spaceship on another planet. It would be totally different. Peter says the world that then existed perished, and this no doubt has a lot more meaning than we typically ascribe to it. This chart gives the lifespans of the patriarchs as recorded in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, and notice the approximate 900-year lifespan before the flood, with the exception of Enoch and Lamech, and then notice this gradual exponential decay in lifespans after the flood. And so the Genesis 11 genealogies, which pick up after the flood, they're not exactly the same wording. It's not as clear cut as the Genesis 5 genealogies, but this seems to provide some evidence for the fact that apparently something is significantly different about the earth immediately after the flood. And this is apparently, I would say, probably due to a major environmental difference now that's affecting lifespans. So size, health, life longevity begin to drop drastically, maybe in a proportional way to what's going on as the earth is calming down from everything that happened in that event, which you now know is way more violent and catastrophic than maybe you realized before. And as further evidence of this major change that apparently occurs, chapter 9, verses 2 and 3 say that animals will begin to fear and dread humans at this point, possibly indicating something about the changed nature of the animals. And then in verse 3, apparently linked to that statement about the animals, you have the first mention of God authorizing a carnivorous diet for humans, which you would think lead to animals fearing humans. Now, whether or not some humans were already eating animals is unclear. They probably were, since nobody's really obeying God anyway. And we know that carnivory is going on in the flood. While the flood's going on, because we see that in the fossil record. But at least God authorizes it here. It's also unclear as to whether this is the point at which animals then are formally become carnivorous in a more widespread way, as we see today. And this isn't necessarily demanded by the text. Another example of how different the world was after the flood is the ice age or the ice surge or the ice advance, depending upon which creation scientists you talk to. So we find a lot of evidence on the earth that a large portion of the land was once covered with ice. In fact, 30% of the land as opposed to what it is today, which is about 10%. So how do we know that? Well, we can observe what happens when glaciers expand and contract, see their effects. And from these observations, we infer that the glaciers of the north used to extend deep down into the northern hemisphere. We find what are called parallel striations, parallel scratches on rocks that will extend over miles and miles of plains from rocks and boulders in glaciers that scratch the bedrock under those glaciers as the glaciers move. And you find faceted rocks that are worn flat from glacier movement. And you find what is called till and moraine that pile up like along the edge of the glaciers as the glaciers are expanding and pushing that material. And then it leaves it when the glacier contracts, and you just find this wall of debris. And so secular geologists today believe that there were multiple ice ages over the last few million years, as many as 50 different ice ages. But there's major problems with the modern interpretation of the evidence for these ice ages. And in fact, no single secular theory has been able to explain all the evidence. So for example, why were all of the animal extinctions, why did they only occur after the supposed last of all those ice ages? We have 167 entire genera of the larger mammals that totally disappear from the earth, and it's only after that last one. Why do you have the disharmonious associations? This is where you have animals that are warm area animals like hippos living contemporaneously with the cold area animals like your woolly mammoth and your reindeer. Why do you have evidence of wet deserts, areas that are today deserts, but clearly went through this period of being wet and lush? And of course, the biggest issue that uniformitarian scientists have is that there is no known natural mechanism, a normal mechanism, that could initiate a single ice age, much less multiple ice ages. So how do you even get one started? And so once again, this is a place where creation science has provided a solid answer to these problems. And in fact, an ice age would be predicted by creationists to follow the flood based on catastrophic plate tectonics. It would be a necessary effect. So the flood would have triggered an ice age. So we would theorize that there weren't multiple ice ages. There was just a single ice age, and even the word age is misleading, because that makes it sound like it's some long period of time. So we would tend to call it more of an ice advance or a surge, because we're thinking that there was a gradual buildup. The main part of this advanced period is only about 700 years, with a peak at about the 500-year mark after the flood. And so Christian scientists would say that all of the evidence that secular meteorologists are using to argue for multiple ice ages over millions of years, it fits into a single major ice advance that lasted just a few hundred years. All right, now what do we need to actually start an ice age? Well, it'd be tempting to say, well, you just need the winter to be colder. Okay, we just need colder temperatures. But that actually would have the opposite effect, because with cold comes dryness. You have less moisture. And that gets at the root of why secular meteorologists can't figure out how to get an ice age started with their perspective, their model. You need three basic ingredients. You need cooler summers, you need more moisture, right? More evaporation and therefore rain and snow, and then you need a persistence of those in order to have enough time for the buildup to occur. All three of these would have been effects of the flood. So here's what we're looking at here. So the volcanic activity going on and the tectonic activity going on in the flood is going to shoot enormous amounts of ash and aerosol into the atmosphere. That's going to block out a lot of solar radiation, which is going to cool your summer. So what that's going to mean is every winter the caps start expanding, and over the summer it's too warm, and so they melt more than they expanded, is usually what we're seeing today. So the caps are getting smaller. But in order to have an ice age, you got to have them melt less in the summer, so that each winter they grow more, and then they contract and grow more and contract. So that's what we're looking at. So if you have a cooler summer, which is what we would predict, then you have less melting, and so the ice is going to continue to advance annually, each winter in waves, instead of melting each summer. So eventually, towards the end of this period, you're going to have more extinctions, because that's when the animal habitats are finally being threatened towards the end of that, as the glaciers get too big. So the pre-flood environment was also likely warmer, including the ocean. And then now you've got all this tectonic activity going on with lava coming onto the floor and so forth of the ocean, creating new ocean floor. So your ocean is going to be a lot warmer. What's going to be the result of that? A lot more evaporation of the seawater, which leads to a lot more precipitation away from the equator especially. So you got more rain, more snow going on. And then the third ingredient, you need persistence of those. And so we would expect that all of this heavy tectonic activity is continuing to go on after the flood for some time. And so the oceans would have continued providing significantly elevated evaporation for possibly centuries. I think this just went out. Did it? Did I see that? I think the battery might have just, either that or I just went partially deaf, but that's possible too. All right. So I'll just talk into the mic while he's getting something. Wait, it's back on? Can you hear me? No? Yes? Could be just because I got up here. Now, towards the end of this primary melting period, we would expect catastrophic melting to occur, which with huge amounts of water forming lakes as these glaciers are melting back towards the poles. So that's going to leave these big lakes along the way. So there would have been natural dams kind of holding the water in these makeshift lakes. And those are going to tend to breach because they're not normally lakes. These are temporary lakes. And that causes the rapid formation of canyons. And again, this is actually a phenomenon that secular geologists acknowledge, this kind of dam breaching that occurs during ice ages. So they would argue, for example, that the Lake Missoula flood was a flood from an ice age known to have occurred due to the failure of one of these natural dams, creating immense destruction, including a 50-mile long trench that is between 1 and 6 miles in width. with walls up to 900 feet high, carved out of solid rock just from one of these lakes breaching. And geologists estimate that 10 cubic miles of basalt from this trench was eroded rapidly during catastrophic flooding from Lake Missoula. And this is the process that we believe is involved in forming the Grand Canyon as well during the ice advance period. So the evidence suggests that the layers of the Grand Canyon were deposited in the flood, but then the carving came rapidly during the ice age due to the breaching of 3 lakes that we think were on the Colorado Plateau. And some of the, where's Lila at, by the way? Where's Lila? Lila's over there. She got to this summer stand in the middle of where one of those lakes would have been. It wasn't summer, it's fall, right? Last fall, she got to stand in that area. Now, the creationist ice advance theory may or may not be true. This is a theory. The Bible doesn't come out and say this. But it has a lot of explanatory power where modern uniformitarian, non-biblical, naturalistic models fail to explain the evidence. It shows that the biblical model has powerful explanatory power in that you can trust what the Bible teaches. So this model explains why you have a huge number of animal extinctions occurring only once. It's because all this evidence fits into one ice age. It explains the disharmonious associations of the animals because you have mild winters, cooler summers. It keeps all the animals relatively mixed where they can live contemporaneously. The evidence for wet deserts is explained by the glacier growth. You have animal dispersions from Asia to America across, for example, the Bering Strait and across the English Channel that helps to explain how you get animals to some of the remote parts of the earth. The rapid formation of post-flood canyons is explained. And the thickness of the ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica, which we'll talk about tomorrow morning, that's explained. And of course, the biggest plus is that we have a clear-cut trigger for how to initiate this. All right, the flood would have demanded an ice age occurs. We have an actual trigger where the uniformitarian models have not been able to come up with a good explanation for that. Now, while all that's going on, the ice age and all, you have humanity alive and reproducing after the flood. And not much is explicitly stated about this period immediately after the flood. There's not really evidence of writing at all for some time. Genesis 10 and 11 give genealogical information about those intervening centuries during what creation scientists would theorize to be the ice advance period. And it helps us to see in Genesis 10 and 11 there which line from Noah repopulated which area of the world. But not much beyond that is known. From Seth to Abram, you have 10 generations. And once again, there isn't evidence of any gaps there to work with. Now that said, while there is no evidence of any gaps in the lineup there in Genesis 10 and 11, Moses' terminology in Genesis 11 is not exactly the same as what he says in chapter 5. It's not that same equation. And when all the evidence is weighed, there is potentially room for a few hundred years to be added to Genesis 11, but we can nail down an upper limit on it. And we're not even talking about thousands, much less millions. And we've got an article on our website that weighs in on that. But keep in mind, when you stand back and you look at the question of time in the genealogies, even if Genesis 11 or Genesis 5 allowed for millions of years worth of time to be injected into the Bible to try to leave room for evolution and uniformitarian geology, it still isn't going to allow the Bible to match evolution whenever you actually know this subject. And here's why. When you look at the actual fossil record, guess where you see humans show up? The genus Homo, which is what we understand to be the humans, it's at the very top. It's just roughly, in radiometric years, evolutionary thinking, 2 to 3 million years ago, based on their time scale. So the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11, those are describing a time when humans are already on the scene. So if you squeeze time in there, where are you squeezing the time? It's at the very top. It's not helping you really make the Bible match evolution in geology, because this is where the bulk of the time is. So you got to squeeze time in before humans are on the scene. You're talking about days 1 through 5 And yet the Hebrew doesn't allow you to do that in Genesis 1 and several other arguments that we could look at. So bottom line, squeezing time, even if you could do that in these genealogies, it's not really helping you. If you're trying to make the Bible fit their paradigm, it's silliness. You can't do that. It's either or. And there's no reason to reject what the Bible teaches on this. Science fits it. So Genesis 11 is not going to help the evolutionist or the old earther. Now, why is that important from a scientific perspective? Well, the implication scientifically is that we can't really nail down precisely when the flood was, or even when creation was, to the year, because of the way this is recorded, particularly in Genesis 10 and 11, and a couple other little factors that can play a role too. So the flood, we usually say, is anywhere between 2350 BC and possibly a few centuries back before that. And creation would be 6,000, sometimes we'll say 8,000 years ago, instead of trying to nail down something very specific. Now, moving forward, you have Babel, and this is probably at the time of Peleg, based on Genesis 10:25. So this could have been as early as 100 years after the flood, okay? So, or a few decades later, according to chapter 11 genealogy. So this is falling during the period of the ice advance, as this is starting to pick up, which might explain humanity's reluctance to obey God and spread out beyond the Palestinian area, or why God chose to step in when he did to make sure that the spread happened before the conditions of the ice age prevented passage, possibly, in some cases. But regardless, while there may have been several human languages before the flood, we don't know how many languages there were before the flood, all of them would have been wiped out except for Noah's family's language. And so by the time of Babel, between the flood and Babel, there's still only one post-flood language being spoken, and then language divisions are supernaturally created by God, and the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth then spread out from Palestine. So notably, human fossils and archaeological artifacts. This is important. Human fossils and archaeological artifacts, the whole human habitat, doesn't appear in flood or pre-flood layers. They're all apparently wiped out in the flood. Have some theories as to what's going on there. But all of the human paleoanthropology studies and archaeology studies about humans is all stuff that is post-flood. So archaeologists study the artifacts and divide that, what we would say, the post-flood period, into what they would call early human history. We would say a lot of time's already passed by the time these artifacts show up, but they divide this time period into the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. And so the Stone Age would correlate to what we would call post-flood, pre-Abraham. Bronze Age is basically Abraham to David, and then the Iron Age from David to about Cyrus, about 550 BC. And so we would correlate the Stone Age especially with the dispersion after Babel and the Ice Age, or the Ice Advance. Now archaeologists, when they look at the artifacts that have been dug up in those early post-flood sediment, they see evidence that humans were nomadic during that time, called hunter-gatherers. They're moving from place to place. I wonder why that is. And they believe they were doing that for, they would say, thousands of years, until they evolved to the point where they could get intelligent enough to settle down and start farming. Now, we would, again, interpret the evidence totally differently. Why were they nomadic? Well, first of all, this was just hundreds of years, not thousands of years. Their dating methods are not giving accurate dates. But yeah, we would agree with the evidence that they're nomadic because after Babel, they're spreading out and filling the earth as God told them to do. And so they're nomadic. So it wasn't that they weren't intelligent enough to put down roots and build houses and farm. It's that they weren't allowed to do that. They already made that mistake at Babel. And so they're spreading out and filling the earth, Genesis 9:1, because God required it. Now keep in mind that many of the Native Americans that the Europeans discovered in the 15th century over here were also nomadic and also weren't writing. And this wasn't because of lack of intelligence, but because they weren't inclined to put down roots in one place. So they weren't staying put for very long, and so you wouldn't expect evidence of cities or even houses for them. And instead, you find evidence, for example, that they would stay in tents or caves. And sure enough, cavemen are associated with the Paleolithic period and the Stone Age. So people were finding shelter in caves because it's great temporary conditions to stay in. Again, this doesn't have to do with intelligence, but more that they didn't have time to put down roots. They're not going to be staying in one place. They're following herds and so forth as they travel around. Then after a few hundred years, when they're finally spread out, they begin to get settled. Different types of archaeological artifacts begin surfacing. Why? Well, more products are being developed by humans that would be useful in a farming culture and in a culture that stays put. And so that becomes the Bronze Age period. As during that time we start finding evidence of writing. So could humans write before that, during the dispersion period? Possibly. They especially would have been intellectually capable of that, but there simply may not have been much of a need for it. So again, a good comparison would be the Native Americans of Northern America who were not writing when the Europeans encountered them. Many of them are drawing pictures, but they're not doing writing, not because of intelligence, but because they really had apparently no interest or need to be developing written languages. They weren't interested in maybe documenting their history and so forth. And keep in mind that although God miraculously made new languages at Babel, humans may have had to develop their own written forms of those languages. There's nothing that's said about that in the text. That may not have been something that God miraculously made. One final interesting point about the Ice Age. When did Job live? First of all, isn't that a cool picture? I asked one of our graphic design guys, like, hey, could you start doing some pictures that kind of depict in a realistic way some of the cool events in Bible history? And I told him I wanted this one for an article I wrote. So you see Job up there and God's talking to him out of a whirlwind. Isn't that cool? Anyway, well, the Bible doesn't tell us when Job lived exactly, and there's a lot of debate about that. But there's some interesting puzzle pieces in the book that shed some light on this subject. There's various clues that cause us to surmise he lived after the flood, maybe the time of Abraham or slightly before. So, for example, a flood is mentioned by Eliphaz, and floods happen a lot, but I only know of one that is directly mentioned as being punishment for wiping out wicked men, which suggests a post-flood date in this case. Job 38:16, God highlights the recesses of the deep, the ocean, which seems to be referring to the deep sea trenches, which didn't form until the flood. Those are the places where when you have a subduction zone, right, that I talked about going on in the flood, that creates a trench along the edges of the subduction zone. That's where all those trenches are found. Also, the text doesn't specifically reveal Job's age when he died. Job 42:16 tells us he lived 140 years after the events described in that book. So how old was he when all of that began? Well, he's old enough to have 10 apparently grown children, but only 10, suggesting that he may have been 50, 60 years old or higher, which would mean he was at least 200 years old when he died. And yet that age is described in chapter 42 and verse 17 as being old and full of days, which wouldn't have described Job if he lived prior to the flood. He would have been a youngster, right? Because people are living 900 years old. So whenever we consider that Terah, Abram's father, lived to be 205, and Abraham lived to be 175, Isaac lived to be 180, Jacob was 147, then we see Job's age fits nicely around the time of Abram. Also, several names are mentioned in Job, which were likely named after individuals who are mentioned in the post-flood period, Genesis 10 through 36, and that argues for Job living post-flood, and those names argue for any living, for Job in particular, living during the pre-Mosaic period, in the patriarchal age. And sources outside of the Bible also verify some of those names as being from the second millennium BC, around the time of Abraham. Also, no mention is made of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities of the plain, in this book, even though it surely would have been known to the inhabitants of Uz, while again the flood is mentioned in the book as would be expected. So this suggests a pre-Sodom and Gomorrah time period. Also arguing for a pre-Mosaic patriarchal time, Job is described as offering sacrifices for his family. Now that's a patriarchal custom that occurred throughout the time before Moses. And also his wealth is measured not in money, but livestock and possessions. That also is a patriarchal thing. Also, God talks directly to Job in chapters 38 through 42, as he did to the patriarchs prior to Moses. Also, no mention is made of anything pertaining to the law of Moses or the events that are affecting the Israelites in Egypt and Canaan, even though Uz, where Job is thought to have lived there, where we think Uz might have been, is thought to have been in that neck of the woods over there, which suggests Job lived pre-Moses. And in fact, his daughters are given an inheritance at the end of the book of Job, which wasn't customary during the Mosaic period. And you can study that as well. Also, a kind of money is mentioned, which dates back to the pre-Mosaic patriarchal period as well. And also the style of the book matches other writings that date to the second millennium BC. So these and other factors suggest that the events of Job take place after the flood, about the time of Abraham, possibly on the tail end of the Ice Age. So with that in mind, it's interesting to note that cities are mentioned as existing in the book, chapter 15, verse 28. And interestingly, there are no known cities in Ice Age layers, which is the Pleistocene layers. And so cities don't actually show up until higher in the rock layers in the Holocene, which is where we understand Abraham must have lived, because cities are clearly in existence during his time, like the 5 cities of the plains, for example, or just one example. But I could only find one reference to cities in the book of Job, which isn't really typical of other Bible books relating historical accounts. And instead of cities, lands are described, or people who eventually had cities or lands named after them. And so Job might have lived at the tail end there of the Ice Age, as cities are just starting to begin to emerge, and at the tail end of the Babel dispersion, transitioning into the time period when cities are being planted, with his life perhaps overlapping with that of Abraham. Now, interestingly, snow and ice are also mentioned several times in the book, even though snow would have likely been even more rare in Uz than it is in Florida today, because it's so close to the equator. So why would snow and ice have been such a hot topic in Job, right? Well, again, it would fit with Job having lived around the time of the Ice Age. So assuming so, then the book of Job tells us a lot about the mindset of mankind at that time, as well as what the animal kingdom was like at that time, including mention of Behemoth, which most accurately matches the description of a sauropod dinosaur, the long-necked, long-tailed dinosaurs. There's nothing else that I think fits it, the more I've studied the anatomy of dinosaurs. And as well as Leviathan, a large marine reptile. So maybe a mosasaur or plesiosaur in the case of Leviathan. Now, as we wrap up, consider once again the flood. Isn't it amazing what you can learn about this event from science? Is this interesting to you? I mean, it's fun, but also it's alarming, because God did that, and He didn't want us to forget it. Right? The rainbow is significant about that. He doesn't want us to forget what happened. God likely executed on the low end, as I showed you, at least 215 million people by drowning, and in some cases in this event, if you think about it, crushing, burning, mutilation, dismemberment, disintegration. God did that. The flood tells us things about God. In particular, it tells us things about His feelings about sin and His concern for His people, who end up being few and far between. Those people that are striving to live righteous lives. He cares for them big time. But He doesn't like sin, and He's not going to deal with it. He's not going to tolerate it. There's a timeline that He's working on. Jesus called the attention of His audience back to the flood in Matthew 24. As the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. They're just going on doing their life like there's nothing going to happen. Everything's normal. Until the day that Noah entered the ark. They did not know until the flood came and took them all away. This simple little phrase means really a lot when you look at the evidence. took them all away, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Is it important to study the works of the Lord like the flood? It's crucial that humanity not forget the significance of this event, and yet it has forgotten it. So humanity has taken the symbol that God put up there for remembrance and turned it into the exact opposite. It is now representative of the very kind of stuff that caused him to bring the flood in the first place. He didn't want this forgotten. And the grace of God gives us little hints to remind us so that we don't make that same mistake. The flood, think about it. The flood is a physical depiction of how he feels about sin and what it means that he is holy. He is set apart. He's different. And he expects a certain behavior from the people that want to be saved on the ark. So when we see high mountains, we shouldn't forget why that mountain exists. It's easy to look at that mountain, oh, that's so pretty. It's so neat that God made the mountains. Wait a minute. Now, you all know better now what's really going on there. The violence involved in creating that mountain in the flood, that was not pretty. That was not pretty. The flood is a reminder of the necessity of human repentance if we want to please Him. All this science is fun, but it should be pointing us to the big message that God wants us to get. The flood is a reminder that judgment can always be just around the corner when we least expect it. But it's also a reminder that those who are like Noah, really trying to obey God and calling on the name of the Lord in the way the Bible says to do that, they can be saved through water and receive the benefits of God's grace. The divine long-suffering once waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, right? We're talking 120 years. He waited, in which a few, that is 8 souls, maybe out of 1 billion, were saved through water. There's also an antitype which now saves us, baptism, not the removal of the filth of the flesh, the answer of a good conscience toward God. Baptism through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Isn't it sad that the bulk of the religious world around us says, nope, I don't accept that. I don't like it. I don't want to have to do something. Well, guess what? Those people, 215 million people, I'm sure, had the same attitude. The people who say to God, yes, sir, whatever you say, I'm in. Those are the people that get on the ark. The people that say, I don't really think I need to be on the ark. I don't think that's going to save me. Well, I'm sorry, you think what you want. God says it. It's up to us to believe it. That's what faith is all about. That's the main thing God expects from us. You believe Him, and therefore you obey Him. That's what's going to save you. Noah could have believed God and not obeyed Him. What would have happened? He would have died like the rest of them. You got to have both. Trust and obey. There's no other way. It's always been that way back to the beginning. Right? All right, let's see here. All right, anything else I want to talk about here? I think not. Okay, so we have laid out the biblical creation model. So what we want to do after a little break, when is the next one supposed to start? What is it, 2:45? 2:45? Is that right? Of course, I'm totally confused on the time right now. What? Oh, yeah, I don't know why. Okay, maybe I just ended a lot earlier. Lucky for you. All right. So, yeah, I think we want to make that probably 15-minute break. We'll start again. And then we'll get to dig into why it's important to have a model like this. Okay, now we're going to start defending what the Bible teaches. You're going to see why having this model will be important. All right, thank you for your attention. Let's take 15 minutes and launch.